It took me 20 years to stop smoking. I spent more of my life than I care to say coping with alcoholic friends and relatives and suicidally depressed friends and relatives. It would have been a lot easier and might have helped a lot if I had a nicotine patch. Right? So I'm going off of Professor Kaczynski's story. Maybe we could eliminate vice. There are ways in which you can lessen the problem of alcoholism. There are ways in which you can greatly relieve suicidal depression. So maybe we should forget about making ourselves more moral, but try to make ourselves less vicious. Thank you.
Oh, okay, good. Well, I can say that in neuroscience, there's been a lot of progress in the last 10 years or so in understanding the neurobiology of self-control, strength of will, these kinds of processes. So I'm really optimistic about the possibility of understanding how self-control works in the brain in the near future, and then using that knowledge of the neurobiological mechanisms to then potentially develop pharmacological or other interventions that could improve willpower. And it's actually funny because I never really thought of self-control as relevant for moral enhancement until very recently. But in some respects, and especially sort of reflecting on what's been said over the last few days, this might be a really good target because it does sort of encompass a lot of other subsumed goals.
But kicking nicotine alone was quite liberating.
Good, because it's a foot taller than I am. Listening to this as an outsider for this wonderful weekend, I'm really struck by a gap. And if you were to ask most people in the world how they understood virtue, how they became more virtuous, how they became more self-controlled, how they understood moral formation, I think most of them would reference religion as part of their answer. And it's been completely absent from this discussion. There is obviously a whole field of psychology of religion, sociology of religion, anthropology, and so on, which does not seem somehow to be in conversation. But just to throw out a random, I'd be very curious, thinking about the version of the trolley problem where the single person on the alternate track is a member of the out-group. So, for example, if you are a member of a universalist religion, you know, which thinks all people are potentially saved and so on, is that going to be different for you answering that question than if you're a member of one which has, say, an exclusive ethnic identity? But I can think of literally 1,000 questions. The Dalai Lama says that the way he manages anger is to meditate. So what's going on in his brain when he does that? And maybe other people could do that. And why aren't people talking about that? Thanks.
I quite agree. We should be talking about it. Several previous speakers over the last couple of days alluded to the ways that, of course, religion and morality, as you say, are tightly entwined. Now, for reasons that we don't really fully understand. You know, we don't understand their coevolution or which came first exactly, or which parts came first. But nevertheless, around the world, religious paradigms, and I did include religious traditions as part of those ethical systems, will regard, of course, moral enhancement as religious enhancement in certain ways. So if you propose something to a religious culture that emphasizes certain virtues over others, like let's say sanctity, purity, or authority, or some combination, they're not going to be particularly impressed by something that we call moral enhancement that does not fit, right? If there's a failure of pattern recognition, if they just don't see it that way. They'll regard it as not only horribly immoral, but quite positively religiously dangerous.
I gestured just briefly at the end of my talk toward embodying practices, and actually I think, although we don't talk much in the philosophical community about those sorts of things, despite the fact that they're an ancient philosophy, you do still find them in different religious traditions, as you mentioned.
The slide I put up that had somebody contemplating or meditating in the sentence, that was my gesturing toward religion also. But I just thought in the context of having 20 minutes, one would gesture to it in a way where it could be at least understood by those, both those with faith and those of a more secular orientation. But I think that's very implicit in at least my view of religion, but there's also religion in the other sense that it's very much different communities of moral socialization in terms of what the attitudes of those communities are, and that wasn't discussed.
So as we've talked about, there are many different components to moral enhancement, but I think many of us are interested in behavior as the outcome very we want to enhance moral behavior. And I think it's important to, so if you view moral enhancement as a system of behavior modification, then I think it's important to have a context where that comes out of. And I think Skinner was perhaps one of the first to propose a technology of altering human behavior many years ago. And he had, of course, a very systems level view where he said behavior is a product of the environment. There are contingencies of reinforcement, and they generate repertoires of behavior, and how do we create environments that generate optimal behavior? So I think that's a very broad macro view, but I think now we've taken it to the very individual level, the micro level. How do we generate optimal moral behavior at the individual level? And I think if we view it as a system of behavioral modification, then there are two components. You're changing goals, you're changing motivation, but you're also changing the ability at the individual level of achieving those goals, of fulfilling those goals. And I think this gets at a very interesting question, which I'd love to hear your feedback on, is moral enhancement, to what extent is that cognitive enhancement? Or is that more? And are they even, can they be independent of each other? So if you look, for example, I'm interested in discounting, very behavioral economics background. So self, other allocations, pro-social behavior, current self, future self allocations, how do you save for the future, and how do you delay gratification? These are all, if you want to improve people's behavior on variables such as these, then either you can change their goals, you can change the weights in their utility function. I think that's a very difficult problem because the optimal is very context sensitive and it's not known. Or you can just give them the cognitive ability to solve these maximization problems more efficiently. And I think in that latter case, then moral enhancement is cognitive enhancement. But in the former case, you're changing their goals and motivations, and that's very difficult to normatively establish. So I'd love to hear your answer to that.
My Jason and David in Starbucks, Jason is actually Jason Bourne. That's what I was thinking of. So yeah, we know how to do aggressive behavioral modification, but it's not at all clear to me that that counts as the kind of moral enhancement that we should be interested in. Right? Not just because of the content, Jason Bourne is trained to be a killer, but also because of the means, right? The threats to authenticity that Eric Krebs was mentioning earlier, I think become real operative there. So from my perspective, what we need beyond just changing behavior is some sort of incorporation of moral content, right? The concerns that animate emotions and the kinds of moral cognitions that be relevant to practical wisdom and context sensitivity and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that there's actually a danger in focusing on behavior as the target of change or enhancement because very, very different motivational and computational processes can produce the same behaviors. And if you're focusing on changing behavior without understanding or even targeting the underlying motivation, then as soon as you get in a different context from the one that you've tested your technology in, you could have very different results. So in the Starbucks case, or in the case of punishment, where people might punish a transgression out of a desire to enforce a social norm or out of a revenge motive, these are two behaviors that look the same on the outside but are motivated very differently. And as soon as you get into a different context where the environmental variables sort of permit different expressions of different behaviors, if you have different motives in that can then lead to a divergence as soon as you get out of the context that you've tested in. So I think that this is the value of sort of this interdisciplinary approach is understanding motives as opposed to behaviors and really targeting those which have relevance for the moral side as well.
I agree, but I disagree. Everything you said is exactly right. But in the end, what we really care about is each other's behavior at the moral level. I mean, if somebody stepped forward and says, I've actually gotten safe and effective pill for morality, and we ask, well, how does it actually concretely affect anybody's behavior in a noticeable way? And we say, no, it doesn't noticeably affect anybody's behavior in any way. That's not what this is about. This is about changing internal motivations or how you feel. People just feel more righteous, but it never affects their behavior. We'd be like, cool, we're waiting for a morality drug, because what we really want is to influence interactions and so forth. Consequences. So we're a little bit consequentialist when it comes at least to behavior. What these internal things would actually have to do is what I call ethical enhancement. And I think we have to distinguish moral enhancement from things like what you're talking about, which is actually ethical enhancement. In other words, there are better and worse ways of arriving at doing the same thing. And so, obviously, these are complex and a lot of systems, and some will have to do more with ethical enhancement, and some will have more to do with just direct behavioral modification.
Just if I could just respond to that, like you can't change a behavior without changing some underlying motivation for the behavior. So, this hypothetical example that you say, well, we don't change behavior, we only change internal representation. I don't see that even possible, because
it would be a very weird drug.
It would, I just don't see that possible. So I'm not sure if that's really the right approach here. I think the overall point that we're trying to make is that, of course, we want to target behavior, but we want to target behavior through the proper route that's going to have the sort of best outcome in as many contexts as possible. And in order to do that, you need to understand the underlying motivation.
There won't be a self-righteousness drug.
I hope not.
It'd be terrible.
And I agree that we wouldn't want to change motivation without a change in behavior. But I can consider a scenario like this: your neighbor is racially and sexually prejudiced against you, but he's really good at disguising it. Does that not matter for the relationship?
If it never, even potentially, remotely, could possibly, under any scenario, affect his behavior in any noticeable way, I'd be interested in it, and I'd want it for him for his own sake, but I'm not sure I need it as long as he stays on this side of the fence. Maybe. I'm just saying there's a distinction there.
Let's take our last question, and then we can...
Great talks. I want to put a historical perspective in and ask your reaction. Behavior change is often promulgated with the collision of a new power center with a group of people. I'll say that the founders of the Christian church were affected by their interchange with the Roman Empire. I'll say that the indigenous people of the Americas and of Africa were affected by European high-tech arrival. So, given that, depending what country you look at, between 1 and 25% of the economy is controlled by criminal gangs. I'll give you Mexico for a current news story. Aren't those people going to be the first adopters of biological cognitive enhancers, fear reducers, mind concentrators? And when that happens, how will the rest of us and our institutions respond to that?
So much for lunch.
You might wait and see what the negative side effects are.
I think the fundamental question there is, if we sever enhancement, whether we call it cognitive or moral or anything, from people's intentions, we're not talking about morality, we're not talking about behavior. And that is really the difficult thing here, is most of these things being discussed could perhaps optimize certain capabilities, but they could be used for all kinds